This memory of mine begins about 3 years ago when I graduated high school. I had grown up with my grandparents, but decided to move to a different and much larger city to live with my dad for the first time in 12 years. I somewhat knew the city already because I spent my summers with him, but this would be the first time I would ever have the freedom of an adult to come and go as I pleased, drive my car anywhere, smoke cigarettes whenever I wanted. I was excited, though sad to leave all my friends. As soon as I settled in, my dad and stepmom sat me down to discuss the few rules and what I needed to know about the complex. Basic things like go wherever you want, but let us know when you leave and when you're coming back, even if it's 2 a.m. Oh, and you'll have to park on the street because the complex has limited parking. One more thing, there's a neighborhood creep. This guy, George, was well known to all the women at the complex, as well as the police that patrolled the area. He was tall and fairly huge, very intimidating looking. My parents were pretty certain that he would leave me alone for one reason: my dad. Though George had a habit of stalking other women in the complex, he would stop to find a new target if a man would show up at their place. A brother, a lover, or father. It didn't matter what he was to the women, or what he looked like. George would back off immediately. Since I lived with my dad, who was also quite tall and rather big, I felt also confident that I would be alright. And I was, for a time. It started about 6 months after I moved in. My stepmom and dad were fighting a lot more until she got up and left him. One night, I was sitting on my porch having a cigarette, browsing Facebook or whatever. I wish I could say that I felt like I was being watched, but I probably just looked up because I felt a bug or something. George was standing 15 feet away, a little behind a tree, staring intently at me. I nearly dropped my cigarette. Shakingly, I stubbed it out and went inside. I was home alone, so I made sure to lock all my doors and then played video games in my room. I told myself I was probably just paranoid. The next morning, I got up from my morning cigarette and coffee. Lo and behold, minutes after I got into my porch, George came ambling out of his apartment to look my way. I sucked down my cigarette and went back inside. This pattern continued for a couple weeks. It was like George stood at his sliding glass door peeking out, waiting to see when I would pop out. I told my dad about it, and he tried to sit with me whenever I went out to smoke. If he came with me, George wouldn't even peep a head out his door. Of course, the other women in the complex have already tried to call the police about George. But he lives in the complex and staring isn't a crime, so there wasn't much they could do. I didn't know how far George had taken it with the other women before. With that info in my mind, I knew that calling wouldn't be much use. Things slowly escalated. Once my stepmom left, I had access to her parking spot. So I only had 3 ways to get from my car to the apartment depending on how I parked. One of the ways just went past George's apartment, about 5 feet from his door. Since I got off work late most nights, I avoided that route as much as possible. Slowly but surely, he memorized my schedule. He would be on one of the paths when I was coming home, not directly on the concrete, but a few feet away on the grass, behind a tree. It was like he thought I couldn't see him. Picture a child hiding terribly behind a tree. You can see 90% of their body and you know that they are there. That's what he would do. I would just run past him, avoid eye contact, but prepare to scream if I ever heard him come after me. I started to carry my keys between my fingertips. I bought a pocket knife and I would walk from my car with it halfway open already, even though I have never been in any kind of fight in my life. Around this time, I believe my mom was trying to find me free self-defense classes, since I couldn't afford anything on my tight budget. My dad was steadily getting more and more pissed off as George edged closer and closer, to escalating as the days went by. It went from November to May. If my dad wasn't home, I would lock my bedroom door and keep my knife under my pillow. I would Skype all night with my boyfriend, just so someone could call 911 for me if need be. I put a bunch of flower pots in front of my bedroom window so that no one could get in silently. I started sitting on the floor of my porch, below the wall out of sight to smoke, but angled so I could see him if he walked up to it. Nightmares of being kidnapped or murdered started to invade my sleep every night. Then one day, my neighbor, Shell, was gossiping to me. "Did you hear about George?" "No." "He got arrested last night. In the complex parking lot, there's a big sort of electrical power box. It stands about waist high and perhaps about 2 to 3 feet wide. About 10 minutes before, I was supposed to come home and park right in front of it. Some lady with her kid walked by and saw George sitting on the box, jerking it. Was he waiting there for me? Jerking off to the thought of me seeing him? Ugh, the thought of that makes me want to puke and scares the hell out of me at the same time. I was relieved for a few days of my stress, but it only was a few days that he was gone. Then he was back, and he went back to the same old routine. One night, he got far braver. It was maybe 7 p.m. when I went out for a cigarette with my dad. A neighbor walked up to chat with my dad, and George came outside and stood up to open the window, staring down at me. "Dude's asking to get his ass kicked," my dad said under his breath. Then he chatted to the neighbor some more. I rolled my eyes, went inside, and played some more video games. I was healing in a World of Warcraft dungeon when I heard Shell shouting, "Where are you?" And I figured he was talking to someone else. Until she burst in my room in a panic, her eyes huge. She hopped from foot to foot. "He's bleeding." "Who?" I asked in bewilderment. "You're dead. Come quick." I made some teenager huffing sound and left my computer, certainly pissing off the rest of the group. I grabbed our little first aid kit filled with band-aids. I thought in my mind that my dad was doing something stupid, like tossing a knife out of his pocket and trying to catch it. But when I stepped outside, I found myself face to face with real horror. About 6 people surrounded my dad, including Shell and my neighbor, Caleb. He was facing away from me. His entire back was just covered in blood. It looked like he had been mauled by a bear. That was seriously my first thought. Caleb's hold on the shirt slipped and blood sprayed. I feel queasy writing this down. I have never in my life been the person people turn to in an emergency. Blood makes me lightheaded, and I have anxiety attacks over not being able to find a specific bookmark. But all of the adults, people around 30 and 40, while I was just 18, around me were panicked aside from Caleb. I needed to be the person that people turned to. I threw the first aid kit onto the porch and told Shell, "Where do we keep our towels?" She rushed to go grab one. "Has anyone called 911?" I shouted. 5 pairs of eyes turned to look at me like they'd never heard 911 before. "No," my dad said. "I can't afford an ambulance." "Shut up," I said. "What happened?" "George stabbed me." So I called 911 and relayed our address and reason for emergency. The operator told us to keep applying pressure to the wound on my father's lower back. My dad is a true champ, even though the sidewalk was just a big puddle of blood. He stayed on his feet until someone thought to go run and get him a chair. I ran back and forth along the walkway to get the police and show them the house that George lived in. And then I ran back and forth to get the paramedics. They were so cold and so agonizingly slow. They walked so calmly, and I wanted to scream at them to run. My dad could be bleeding out, don't you care? I learned later that they don't run because if they let
Welcome to Apex Legends. I am Bloodhunter. You can call me Bloodhound. Let us begin with basic movement. Complete the checklist on your HUD. Follow me. Sliding down hills increases speed. Remember, you start with nothing and must seek out supplies on your own. Welcome to Apex Legends. I am Bloodhunter. You can call me Bloodhound. Let us begin with basic movement. Complete the checklist on your HUD. Follow me. Sliding down hills increases speed. Remember, you start with nothing and must... Inside the territories, you can find supply bins that carry weapons and resources you will need to survive. Open one. Strong work. Grab your supplies. Your HUD will show what you have equipped. Follow the checklist to access and cycle through your inventory.
Just a sec. 1 second.
zellstarwing 55 says. /system 123 dfghfh. zellstarwing 55 says. Hey.
Safety's up, weapons free.
Death finds a way.
I've seen it all.
Today will be one of those experiences where you'll sit back and say, oh yeah, I remember that.
Introducing your champion.
Landing in this area yields a high probability for success. Placing gas trap.
Attention. First blood.
I got a bad guy.
First blood.
Shots fired, and they're hitting me.
Beginning.
Get the bamboozling.
Deployed.
Reloading.
Down one. What a waste. One ammo.
Smoke out.
Adrenaline kick in, mistakes can happen. They shoved Caleb out of the way because he refused to let go of my dad's wound and got him packed into the ambulance. I was about to jump on when the police stopped me and told me that I had to stay so I could give a statement. My dad shouted to me to call his boss, and I remembered all of his allergies and whatnot for the paramedics. God, 2 years later and all these details have been burned into my brain. I gave my statement to the police. Then they made me sit outside the complex on the sidewalk for 2 to 3 hours. They kept me updated on my dad. Once I called his boss, my boss, and answered my stepmom's message, that's when I allowed myself to break down. It felt like I cried forever. One of those cops was nice enough to go into my house and grab my cigarettes and a bottle of water for me. He stayed with me the entire time to make sure I didn't run off or something, but he was very nice. He offered to let me sit in his cruiser a few times to get away from the cold. George was waiting in his apartment when they came. When they took him out to where I was, he kept trying to stare at me. I stared right back at him and felt such hatred that I've never felt in my life. I wanted to go over there and murder him. My babysitting cop looked over and saw George was staring, so he used his flashlight to keep George from being able to look at me. Once it was all over, I was allowed to go back into my house where I waited for information about my dad. I gathered the story from my neighbors while he was at the hospital for 9 days. He had shouted at George to leave his daughter alone, and George shouted back at him while I was in the house, totally unaware. George said something along the lines of, "Come tell me to my face like a man," So my dad hopped over the porch and waltzed up to him. The creep had been waiting with a 12-inch blade held to the side of his leg. He struck out with his empty hand, and then got my dad in the back with the knife. It missed his kidney very, very narrowly, traveled up and punctured his lung, and then damaged his diaphragm. My dad didn't realize he had been stabbed at first. He got George into a headlock and hit the crap out of him, thinking the dude had just punched him in the kidney. George dropped the knife, rolled on the grass, and picked up another knife he had been hiding and stabbed my dad again, this time his upper back. This wound was much more shallow, but still required stitches later. At this point, Shell came outside and screamed to my dad that he was bleeding. He took off his shirt, got pissed, and threw it at George. At that point, the neighborhood stalker put his hands up and went into his apartment. The blood stayed on the pavement until noon the next day, when my neighbors kindly washed it off for me. I still have pictures in my email of it, as well as my dad's injuries. My dad spent more time in the hospital in critical condition than George spent being held in jail. I feel like this was my fault. I've been addressing that in therapy, but I still feel awful about it all, like my dad had to fight my own battle for me. Throughout the week while I was on my porch or just sat outside, I had many women come up to me. They all told me to thank my dad for them. They all had been terrorized by George at some point, and now they were certain that he would be away for good. Several poor women had George stalk them up to their apartment door and pull down his pants, demanding sex. I can't believe the cops couldn't do anything. One of those days, one of my neighbors came up to tell me that the police and neighbors had searched the complex and found that George had stashed many knives all over the place, buried in gardens, stuck behind trees, under his doormat. I shudder to think that he might have planned one day to grab one of his targets and do something far more sinister than stare. George was declared guilty for battery with a deadly weapon, but the attempted murder charge was dropped. He was out of prison by Christmas on good behavior or whatever, but my dad and I have a lifelong restraining order against him. He has never tried to come after me, so I can only hope that he's terrified of my dad. I wish I could tell you guys that I took self-defense classes and learned to fight the way my dad can, but I'm still a wimp who can't slap a spider. My dad is doing all right now. He's just had his third surgery on Tuesday, trying to repair the damage done to him internally. We're hoping that will be his last, and his quality of life will vastly improve. I probably owe my life to my dad. If he hadn't fought for me, maybe I would have been the first victim George stabbed. Last night, I had an experience with what I believe to be a skinwalker. I was sleeping on my couch. I'm in the process of remodeling my bedroom. It had been storming on and off all night, but in that moment, the wind was only blowing.
Playing Final Fantasy. Bruh.